Gary Johnson's titanium combat armor dripped with glowing fluorescent green Quomar blood as he pummeled Alien King Xenos' face into a ruptured mess of mangled flesh, the thousand-strong crowd of bloodthirsty insectoid Quomar spectators screeching for more violence, more savagery from the lone human fighter. There were no rules, no sanctions, no holds barred. The only law was that anything goes. Aboard the massive Quomar dreadnought warship orbiting Earth, two mortal foes fought to the death, their decades-long enmity coming to a head in this final confrontation. For years, Xenos and his ruthless Quomar warriors had waged a campaign of relentless destruction across human space, slaughtering colonists by the millions on planets such as Morgan's World, Hyperion, New Tokyo. Each time, Gary Johnson and his squad of elite human space marines had beaten back the alien assaults, but Xenos always escaped. "Filthy human scum! I will rip your spine out through your throat," Xenos snarled, his serrated beak snapping centimeters from Gary's jugular. Gary head-butted the Quomar King and kneed him in the thorax. "Talk shit while you can, Xenos, because when I'm done with you, it's just gonna be shit." Not this time. Xenos had gone too far. It got personal when the Alien King murdered Gary's brother Steve in cold blood after promising him quarter in a duel. Now Gary would make him pay. But this wasn't just about vengeance. The stakes had never been higher. The Quomar had sworn an ironclad oath. If Gary defeated Xenos in single combat, they would abandon their attacks on humanity and retreat from human-controlled space forever. But if Xenos won, the Quomar would be free to annihilate Earth and the billions of humans living there using their devastating planet-wrecking magnetic accelerator cannons. As he traded bone-shattering blows with Xenos, Gary's mind flashed back to intelligence briefings he'd attended at Space Marine HQ. The Quomar considered Earth to be a Deathworld, a planet teeming with such hyper-lethal flora, fauna, and ferocious apex predators that it constituted an existential threat to their galactic hegemony, a planet where nearly every species, from the massive megafauna to the microscopic bacteria, could kill Quomar warriors in horrifying ways, where even the air, water, and soil was toxic to the aliens. If humanity was allowed to spread out from this evolutionary crucible and fully harness the Deathworld's capabilities, it would mean the end of Quomar dominance. And so, the aliens sought to quarantine and exterminate mankind. But there was a flaw in their plan. They didn't fully understand the depths of human resolve and resilience. As he hammered Xenos with a flurry of punches and kicks, Gary knew that the survival of the human race hinged on this battle, and he would not fail. He could not fail. Humanity had to prevail. Gary's fist smashed again and again into Xenos' alien face as the crowd screeched in bloodthirsty frenzy. The Quomar King staggered back from the onslaught, fluorescent blood spraying in glowing arcs. But then Xenos' eyes flashed, and he hissed a guttural command in his alien tongue. In an instant, a shimmering silver liquid flowed out from beneath Xenos' shredded combat suit, slithering over his body and hardening into a suit of flexible armor. Gary's eyes went wide. Quomar nanotechnology. With a roar, Xenos lashed out with lightning speed, his new armor-enhanced strength sending Gary flying back across the arena in a dizzying tumble. The crowd howled as Gary smashed into the far wall and crumpled to the floor, his armor sparking and smoking. Xenos stalked forward, serrated beak clicking. Gary shook his head and struggled to push himself to his feet, but in a blur of motion, Xenos was on him, pummeling Gary with punch after crushing punch. Pain exploded through Gary's body as the alien lifted him up and hurled him across the arena again. Gary hit the ground hard, his head ringing. Through blurred vision, he saw Xenos charging at him like a freight train, clawed hands raised to deliver a killing blow. Gary's hand scrabbled at a compartment on his combat armor and found the activator for the V-23 serum injector. The world seemed to slow to a crawl. Gary could feel the serum coursing through his veins like liquid fire, his perceptions sharpened to crystal clarity. His muscles surged with superhuman power. As Xenos lunged in for the kill, Gary moved, sidestepping the alien's attack with preternatural speed. Spinning around behind Xenos, Gary launched himself at the warlord's back and unleashed a devastating uppercut. Crack! Xenos' head snapped back as Gary's fist connected, luminescent blood spraying. The Quomar king went flying head over heels to crash in a heap on the arena floor. Gary stood tall, adrenaline and V23 serum surging through him. He watched as Xenos picked himself up with a snarl, wiping glowing blood from his mangled mouth. Gary grinned savagely and beckoned for Xenos to come at him again. The Quomar had their nanotech armor, but they'd never encountered anything like V23. Now the playing field was level again. Xenos roared in fury as Gary matched him blow for blow. The alien king smashed his battle gauntlets together, crackling plasma energy surging across his armor. He lunged at Gary in a frenzied assault, plasma-enhanced punches scorching deep gashes across the human's titanium armor. Gary staggered back under the onslaught, warning alarms blaring in his helmet. "You cannot win this time, human," Xenos snarled, hammering Gary with another devastating plasma blow. "I will reduce you to ashes." Gary gritted his teeth against the pain and deployed his vibroblades. The hypersonic blades hummed to life along his forearms. Gary launched himself back at Xenos, slashing the vibrating blades in a whirlwind of lethally precise strikes. The blades cleaved through Xenos' nano-armor like it was paper, drawing gouts of luminous green blood that splattered across the arena floor. The Quomar spectators shrieked in bloodthirsty excitement as the two champions traded earth-shattering strikes, plasma and vibroblades clashing again and again in blinding flashes and showers of sparks. The walls of the arena shuddered and cracked from the sheer concussive force of the battle. Craters and scorch marks pitted the floor, the air hazy with smoke and dust. Xenos bellowed and charged at Gary, plasma gauntlets blazing with hellish light. At the last second, Gary sidestepped and slashed his vibroblades across Xenos' side, carving deep rents in the armor. But Xenos pivoted with startling speed and tackled Gary in a crushing embrace. The impact sent them both smashing through the weakened arena wall in an avalanche of shattered metal and stone. The Quomar ship disappeared above them as they plummeted down through the atmosphere, locked in mortal struggle. Xenos pounded Gary with plasma-enhanced punches as they fell, trying to burn through his armor. Gary suddenly realized Xenos' intent. The alien was angling their descent to land on Earth's surface, where the Quomar invasion forces could reinforce him and overwhelm Gary. Wind howling around them, Gary frantically grappled with Xenos, trying to pry the alien's claws off him. They plunged through the stratosphere in a dizzying whirl of traded blows. With a desperate shout, Gary wrenched one arm free and slammed his fist onto a button on his armor. The emergency teleport. Blinding light exploded around them. An instant later, they crashed into the ground with pulverizing force, a shockwave of pulverized concrete and rebar erupting from the impact. Gary clambered to his feet, head ringing. He scanned their surroundings, crumbling buildings, mountains of rusted metal and debris, dead trees clawing at an ashen sky, definitely not a human-controlled area. His armor's HUD flickered to life, a radiation warning flashing urgently. High-rad levels detected, known contaminated zone, Chernobyl exclusion zone. "Fuck me," Gary breathed. He'd meant to port them to a human base. But in the chaos, his armor had defaulted to an emergency contingency site instead, one of the most hostile places on Earth. Piles of rubble shifted, and a battered Xenos rose from the debris, nano-armor shimmering as it repaired itself. The alien fixed glowing eyes on Gary and hissed. All around them, the ruins stirred with movement. Hunched figures skittered out of the shadows on twisted limbs, mouths distended in shrieks of rage. Skin flickering with eerie bioluminescence, the mutants closed in, drawn by the disturbance. Gary raised his vibroblades and faced Xenos across the hellish no-man's land, ready for the next round. Even here he would find a way to win. He had to. Earth was counting on him. Claws raked against metal as a pack of wolves leapt at Gary, their hides glistening with an oily sheen. He whirled and fired his plasma rifle in a sweeping arc, searing beams slicing through the beasts. Gobbets of mutated flesh splattered across cracked pavement. A shuddering impact knocked Gary off balance, as a hulking bear thing rammed into him from behind. He hit the ground hard, breath driven from his lungs. Rolling desperately, he barely avoided a swipe of foot-long claws that gouged furrows in the concrete. The bear loomed over him, a mountain of matted fur and bulging tumors. Luminous green saliva dripped from its distended jaws. Gary shoved his rifle into its open maw and pulled the trigger, painting the ruins with steaming viscera. Nearby, Xenos smashed his gauntlets together, a thunderous boom echoing off crumbling walls. He backhanded a leaping wolf, caving in its skull and sending it pinwheeling away. His armor flared with crackling energy as he punched clean through the torso of another beast. Clambering to his feet, Gary stood back-to-back with Xenos as the mutant horde closed in, a tide of snapping jaws and slashing claws. "Never thought I'd be fighting alongside you, Xenos," Gary shouted over the din of battle, blasting a wolf's head into mist. "Mark this moment, human," Xenos growled. "It will not happen again." The alien ripped a bear in half with his gauntlets, tossing the pieces aside. A whining buzz filled the air and a black cloud descended, insects the size of dogs, pincers clacking and dripping with venom. They swarmed the two warriors, clawing and biting. Xenos roared as he ripped the bugs off his armor, crushing them by the handful. Gary ignited his plasma blades and slashed the air around him into a storm of fire, incinerating the insects in droves. The ground rumbled and heaved. Fissures split the concrete as a behemoth emerged from the earth, a worm-like abomination hundreds of feet long, iridescent scales rippling along its segmented hide. Its circular maw yawned open, revealing rows of grinding, whirling teeth. Fluorescent blood streaking his armor, Xenos charged the Titan worm, gauntlets shimmering with power. Gary laid down a hail of covering fire, plasma bolts stitching up the creature's side. Man and alien threw themselves into the thick of the mutant swarm, death and mayhem swirling around them as they fought on. A savage calm descending as they lost themselves to the madness and fury of battle. Just as Gary and Xenos were starting to gain the upper hand against the mutant horde, the ground erupted beneath them. A colossal centipede-like creature burst forth, its armored exoskeleton glistening with toxic slime. Over 100 feet long, the monster towered above them, venomous mandibles snapping. The centipede lunged, forcing Gary and Xenos to dive in opposite directions. Concrete shattered under the impact of the creature's bulk. As Gary rolled to his feet, he saw Xenos caught in the monster's jaws. "Xenos!" Gary shouted. The centipede carried the struggling Quomar off into the ruins. Despite their enmity, Gary couldn't leave Xenos to this fate. He charged after them, vaulting rubble and blasting mutants that dared impede him. He followed the path of destruction left by the centipede. The creature had descended into the crumbling remains of the Chernobyl power plant. Gary plunged into the dark, twisting tunnels. The labyrinthine corridors echoed with the sounds of Xenos' battle cries and the centipede's chitinous bulk scraping against concrete. Gary burst into the heart of the power plant, a cavernous chamber littered with the twisted wreckage of machinery. Pools of radioactive sludge cast an eerie glow. In the center of the chamber, Xenos grappled with the giant centipede. The Quomar king dodged stabbing limbs and venomous bites, retaliating with crushing blows from his plasma gauntlets that cracked the monster's exoskeleton. Gary raised his rifle and opened fire, targeting the centipede's armored weak points. Ichor sprayed as plasma bolts punctured the creature's hide. The monster shrieked, rearing up on dozens of trunk-like legs. It raked at Xenos with scythe-like claws, forcing the alien to disengage. The centipede rounded on Gary, multiple eyes blazing with alien malice. It skittered toward him, mandibles extended. Gary dove forward, sliding beneath the creature's belly as deadly pincers snapped shut inches above him. He fired his rifle point-blank into the monster's underside, blasting fist-sized holes in its armored carapace. Viscous fluids rained down as the creature thrashed in pain. A barbed appendage caught Gary in the chest, sending him flying. He crashed against a crumbling wall, the impact driving the breath from his lungs. The centipede barreled toward him, its bulk demolishing concrete and rebar. Plasma blast suddenly hammered the creature's flank. Xenos had rejoined the fight, pouring fire into the monster. The centipede reeled, ichor gushing from its wounds. It whirled to face the Quomar king, its movements growing sluggish. Gary pushed to his feet and charged back into the fray. He launched himself onto the creature's back, stabbing his vibro blades into its hide. The monster bucked and writhed, trying to dislodge him. Clinging to the embedded blades, Gary dragged himself up the creature's back, fighting for every inch. The centipede slammed itself against the chamber walls, attempting to crush Gary. Bones creaked inside his armor as he endured the impacts. Below, Xenos pressed the attack, hammering the monster's head with plasma bolts. Gary reached the base of the centipede's skull. He ripped his vibroblades free and plunged them into the creature's eyes. The monster shrieked, nearly throwing Gary off. He held on, twisting the blades deeper. In a last, desperate attack, the centipede lunged for Xenos, mandibles extended to deliver a killing bite. Xenos stood his ground, catching the creature's jaws with his gauntlets. The Quomar's armor strained as he grappled with the monster, barely holding it at bay. Seeing his opening, Gary drew his monomolecular combat knife and stabbed it into the base of the creature's skull, severing its nerve stem with a vicious twist. The centipede spasmed violently, a keening wail erupting from its maw. Then it collapsed, its immense bulk slamming to the ground in a cloud of ash and debris. Gary rolled clear of the carcass, gasping for breath. His armor was dented and scorched, its systems sputtering. Xenos was in no better shape, his nano-armor torn and sparking. The two warriors faced each other across the centipede's corpse, half buried in the rubble of the ruined power plant. Around them, the groans and shrieks of mutated abominations echoed through the twisted corridors. They were battered and exhausted, but still standing. The battle was far from over. Gary and Xenos threw themselves back into the fray, unleashing a whirlwind of plasma blasts, vibro-blade slashes, and crushing gauntlet strikes against the colossal centipede. The creature's armored exoskeleton deflected their blows, its hideous bulk absorbing the impacts. It lashed out with stabbing limbs and snapping mandibles, forcing the warriors to dodge and weave. Xenos ducked under a slashing claw and retaliated with a plasma-wreathed fist, slamming it into the centipede's thorax. The creature shrugged off the blow and whipped around, its serpentine body smashing into Xenos and sending him flying. The Quomar king crashed into a crumbling wall, his armor cracking under the impact. Gary leapt forward, vibroblades humming, and carved deep gashes into the centipede's flank. Viscous ichor sprayed from the wounds. The monster shrieked and bucked, its armored tail catching Gary in the chest and hurling him across the chamber. He smashed into a bank of corroded machinery, metal and plastic shattering under the force. Shaking his head to clear the stars from his vision, Gary staggered to his feet. His eyes widened as he saw the centipede rearing up over Xenos's prone form, its mandibles spread wide for a killing bite. In that moment, Gary made a decision. He charged forward, ignoring the pain lancing through his body, and leapt onto the centipede's back. Finding purchase on the monster's ridged exoskeleton, Gary plunged his vibroblades deep into its hide, seeking vital organs. The centipede writhed and thrashed, trying to throw him off. Gary held on with grim determination, stabbing again and again. His blades pierced through the tough armor and struck something vital within the creature. The centipede spasmed violently, a keening wail erupting from its maw, and then collapsed, its immense bulk crashing to the ground. Gary rolled clear of the twitching carcass, his armor slick with the creature's ichor. He staggered over to Xenos and offered the Quomar king his hand. Xenos stared at the proffered hand for a long moment before clasping it firmly, allowing Gary to haul him to his feet. The two warriors stood amidst the carnage, battered and bloody but alive. Xenos looked at Gary, a flicker of newfound respect in his alien eyes as he acknowledged the human's aid. Gary returned the nod, a moment of understanding passing between them. The moment was shattered by a deafening roar from above. The chamber shook as something immense landed on the roof of the power plant, sending debris raining down around Gary and Xenos. They shared a look, hands tightening on their weapons. Whatever new horror had arrived, they would face it as they had the centipede, together. the battle was far from over. With a deafening shriek that shook the chamber to its foundations, an immense mutated bird of prey smashed through the ceiling in an avalanche of crumbling concrete and twisted rebar. Gary and Xenos dove aside as the nightmarish creature landed amidst the rubble, its wingspan stretching over 50 feet from tip to tip. It was a grotesque fusion of eagle and pterodactyl, with wickedly hooked talons and a serrated beak large enough to swallow a man whole. The bird's eyes blazed with alien intelligence as it focused on the two warriors. It screamed a challenge that made Gary's bones vibrate inside his armor and launched itself forward, razor-sharp claws extended. "Move!" Gary shouted, firing his plasma rifle at the charging monstrosity. Plasma bolts flared against the creature's hide but glanced off, leaving only faint scorch marks on feathers that shimmered with an unnatural metallic sheen. Xenos activated his gauntlets and met the mutant's charge head-on, slamming an energy-wreathed fist into its breast. The creature shrieked and staggered back a step, but seemed more enraged than injured. It lunged forward, lashing out with its hooked beak. The Quomar barely managed to avoid the strike, the beak's serrated edge scoring a glancing hit across his helmet. Xenos hammered his gauntlets against the side of the creature's head to seemingly no effect. In a blinding flurry of motion, the mutant snatched Xenos off the ground, talons punching through his armor like it was paper. The Quomar roared in pain and fury as the bird spread its wings and smashed through the crumbling roof, carrying its prey up into the contaminated sky. "Xenos!" Gary shouted. He fired his jump jets, rocketing up through the hole torn in the ceiling and into the open air above the ruins. The bird was already hundreds of feet up, banking and wheeling as Xenos rained blows on its talons in a desperate attempt to break free. Gary angled his jump jets and shot after the creature, the ground rapidly dwindling below. The bird's wings beat the air with thunderous concussions, propelling it forward at incredible speed, but the jump jets were faster. Gritting his teeth, Gary overtook the bird and slammed into its broad back, clinging to the metallic feathers. Up close, he could feel the raw power in the creature's muscles as it flew, each wing beat, nearly shaking him loose. The wind roared in his ears as he dragged himself hand over hand towards the bird's head, searching for a vulnerability, any weakness he could exploit. But the hide beneath the feathers was tough as battle plate. Below, Xenos had ceased his struggles, hanging limp in the creature's talons in an attempt to avoid aggravating his wounds. The bird glanced back at Gary with a baleful eye and opened its beak in another ear-splitting shriek. Banking hard to the side, it went into a spiraling dive, corkscrewing through the air at breakneck pace. The ground spun dizzyingly far below as Gary clung on for dear life, his stomach lurching. All the while the bird's beak darted down, snapping and pecking at Xenos, trying to tear the helpless Quomar apart. Gary's mind raced. At this rate, Xenos would be ripped to shreds long before they stood a chance of killing this thing. And if he fell from this height, even his armor wouldn't save him. They needed a plan. They needed to work together. "Xenos!" he shouted over the wind. "I have an idea, but you're going to have to trust me." The Quomar lifted his head to stare at Gary, eyes burning with pain and humiliation at being reduced to this state. But after a moment, he nodded. Xenos hesitated for only a second before baring his teeth in a savage grin. "Let's do it, human!" The mutant bird leveled out of its dive and swooped low over the ruins, still trying to shake Gary off. The human took a deep breath, muscles tensing. It was now or never. Now! Xenos roared as he detonated his gauntlets, the weapons overloading in a blinding flare of plasma energy. The bird shrieked in agony, its talons blown apart by the blast. Xenos fell free, trailing smoke, hands a ruined mess. At the same instant, Gary leapt from the creature's back, arms outstretched. He collided with Xenos in mid-air, clamping his arms around the Quomar's torso. The ground rushed up to meet them, hard and unforgiving. "Punch it!" Gary shouted in Xenos's ear. The alien's hand shot down, almost faster than the eye could follow, and slapped a button on his belt. Arcs of crackling energy enveloped the two of them as Xenos's teleporter activated. The world strobed out of existence. And they slammed into the ground in a forest clearing, miles from the ruins of Chernobyl. Gary and Xenos lay there for a long moment, breathing hard, not quite able to believe they'd survived. Behind them, the mutant bird's furious screams echoed through the air, promising retribution. Gary rolled to his feet and offered Xenos a hand up. The Quomar swayed unsteadily, his hands a burned ruin, but his eyes were alight with battle fever. He clasped Gary's hand firmly with the stumps of his wrists. "You fought well, human," Xenos rasped. "I owe you my life." "Don't go soft on me now, Xenos," Gary replied with a weary grin. "This is far from over. That thing's still out there, along with God knows what else in this hellhole." The alien's mandibles clacked in the Quomar equivalent of a laugh. "Then let us finish this, Gary Johnson. Together." The human nodded, fresh determination surging through his veins. He pulled a medipack from his belt and tossed it to Xenos. "Patch yourself up. We've got a long way to go, and a lot more ugly bastards to kill." As Xenos tended to his wounds, Gary turned to scan the poisoned forest, already planning their next move. Whatever horrors this mutant-infested wasteland held, whatever challenges they still had to face, one thing was certain: he and Xenos would face them side by side, no longer as enemies but as brothers in arms. Gary and Xenos hit the ground hard, the wind driven from their lungs by the impact. Groaning, they untangled themselves and pushed to their feet, armor sparking and servos whining in protest. As they took in their surroundings, a chill ran down Gary's spine. They stood in a blasted, desolate wasteland, the ground cracked and parched beneath their boots. Strange, twisted rock formations loomed on all sides, their shapes too regular to be natural. An eerie, greenish light suffused the landscape, casting long shadows that seemed to writhe with a life of their own. But it was the figures surrounding them that made Gary's blood run cold. Towering humanoid shapes, their skin the texture of weathered stone, their eyes blazing with an unearthly, radioactive glow. Dozens of them, standing in a silent, menacing circle around the two warriors. "What the hell are these things?" Gary muttered, raising his rifle. "Chernobyl golems," Xenos rasped, his voice strained with pain. "Born from the fusion of radiation, rock, and tortured human souls. I thought they were just a legend." The golems began to advance, their movements slow but inexorable. Gary and Xenos instinctively moved to stand back to back, weapons at the ready. But both of them knew they were in no shape for another prolonged fight. Gary's armor was battered and scorched, its systems flickering on the verge of failure. Xenos was in even worse shape, luminescent blood leaking from the rents in his exoskeleton, his hands reduced to mangled stumps by the detonation of his gauntlets. As the golems closed in, their intentions all too clear, Gary felt a sudden pressure in his mind, like the onset of a crushing headache. From the way Xenos stiffened against his back, he knew the Quomar felt it too. "You—" a voice boomed inside Gary's skull, a chorus of 100 agonized whispers. "Defiler! Despoiler! Murderer!" the voices hissed in Xenos's mind. "Destroyer!" Gary gasped as a flood of images poured into his brain, visions of Earth's tortured history, seen through the eyes of the golems. He saw the planet ravaged by war, by pollution, by the unchecked avarice and cruelty of humanity. He saw forests leveled, oceans choked with plastic, the skies turned to poisonous smog. And he saw the Quomar invasion, the alien fleet raining destruction from above, adding to the planet's suffering. The agony of millions of deaths, human and animal alike, seared into his mind like a brand. Beside him, Xenos staggered as the psychic assault hit him as well. The Quomar experienced the destruction wrought by his own kind, the cities reduced to ash, the landscapes blasted to glass by the heat of their weapons. He felt the anguish of a world pushed to the brink by the unrelenting assault. The golems' minds pulsed with rage, with a bottomless, fathomless pain. The very soul of the earth crying out in torment, and Gary and Xenos were the focus of that rage, representatives of the forces that had torn the planet apart. The towering figures raised their arms, the very ground trembling beneath them. Shards of rock tore themselves free from the earth, hovering in the air around the golems like a deadly halo. Gary and Xenos braced themselves as the stone projectiles hurtled towards them, knowing that this time there might be no escape. The embodiment of Earth's vengeance bore down on them, and they would have to fight with everything they had left, not just for their own survival, but for the fate of the planet itself. The first barrage of rocks slammed into Gary and Xenos, cracking armor and drawing blood. They staggered under the onslaught, but stayed on their feet, returning fire with plasma bolts and vibroblades. The air shook with the thunder of explosions and the crash of stone against metal as the battle was joined. But even as they fought, the images continued to assault their minds, scenes of devastation and ruin, of a world pushed to the edge by the unrelenting march of war, and underneath it all, the cries of the Earth itself, a wordless, eternal scream of anguish that threatened to drown out all thought, all reason. Gary gritted his teeth and kept fighting, his rifle bucking in his hands as he sent a hail of plasma into the advancing golems. Beside him, Xenos lashed out with kicks and headbutts, his armor dented and scorched but still intact. They moved together like a well-oiled machine, covering each other's blind spots, watching each other's backs. A lifetime of enmity forgotten in the face of this new threat, this embodiment of a planet's rage. A massive boulder caught Gary in the chest, sending him flying backwards to crash into a twisted pillar of rock. He felt ribs crack under the impact, his vision going grey at the edges. Gasping for breath, he struggled to push himself upright, his rifle lying shattered beside him. Xenos stood alone against the tide of stone, a lone figure in battered armor, surrounded by a sea of implacable, glowing-eyed giants. The golems pressed in, their psychic voices rising to a deafening crescendo. "Suffer as the Earth has suffered," they boomed. "Die as the Earth is dying." A flurry of rocks hammered Xenos to his knees, his armor finally giving way under the relentless assault. He looked up at the towering figures, his eyes defiant, even as blood ran from his mouth. "So we're not the enemy," he gasped out. "Not anymore." Gary dragged himself to Xenos's side, one arm wrapped around his shattered ribs. He looked up at the golems, his voice ragged with pain but filled with conviction. "We're trying to save Earth," he panted, "to stop the war, to heal the damage." The golems paused, their glowing eyes fixed on the two battered warriors at their feet. The pressure on Gary and Xenos's minds eased slightly, the images of destruction replaced by a sensation of questioning, uncertainty. "Words," the golems intoned. "Hollow words, from hollow men." Gary shook his head, forcing himself to stand straight despite the agony lancing through his body. He looked the golems in the eye, his gaze unwavering. Beside him Xenos nodded, his own eyes blazing with the same fierce resolve. "I swear it too," the Quoma rasped. "On the blood of my people, on the ashes of our worlds, I will see Earth restored, no matter the cost." For a long, tense moment, the golems stared down at them, their expressions unreadable. The very air seemed to tremble with the weight of their judgment. And then, slowly, ponderously, the towering figures lowered their arms. The rocks hovering around them fell to the ground with a series of dull thuds. The glow in their eyes dimmed, the pressure on Gary and Xenos's minds fading away. "We will hold you to your word," the golems intoned, "for the sake of the Earth, for the sake of all life." Gary and Xenos stood side by side, battered and bloody but unbowed, as the golems began to dissolve, their forms crumbling back into the dust and stone from which they had arisen. "We will be watching," the voices whispered in their minds, "always watching." And then the golems were gone, leaving only the wind-swept wasteland and the two warriors, human and Quoma, united by a common purpose and an unbreakable oath. Gary turned to Xenos, a wry smile tugging at his lips despite the pain of his injuries. Xenos snorted, a sound that might have been laughter or a grunt of pain. "Indeed, but we have our work cut out for us now." Together, the two warriors limped off into the desolate landscape, their steps heavy but their resolve unshakable. The fate of a world rested on their shoulders. And they would not fail. Gary and Xenos fought back to back, blades and gauntlets flashing in the eerie light as they battled the relentless onslaught of the golems. The stone creatures pressed in from all sides, their glowing eyes filled with ancient rage. Explosions rocked the wasteland as plasma bolts and vibroblades clashed against rock-like flesh. But for every golem they felled, two more seemed to take its place. The ground trembled under the weight of the advancing horde. Gary's rifle clicked empty, its power cell drained. Xenos' gauntlets flickered and died, their energy reserves spent. Battered and bleeding, the human and Quomar retreated step by step, driven back by the inexorable tide of living stone. The golems herded them into a narrow canyon, the walls rising up on either side like the jaws of a trap. Gary and Xenos stood at the canyon's dead end, chests heaving, weapons raised in defiance. The golems advanced, their footsteps shaking the earth. There was nowhere left to run. "Looks like this is it, Xenos," Gary panted, his vibroblades humming. "It's been an honor fighting alongside you." Xenos nodded, his mangled hands sparking. "Likewise, human, let us die well." The golems loomed over them, their massive fists raised to deliver the final crushing blows. Gary and Xenos tensed, ready to meet their end head-on. Suddenly, a thunderous explosion ripped through the canyon. The walls buckled and collapsed, tons of rock and debris raining down on the golems. Gary and Xenos threw themselves to the ground as the canyon shook itself apart. As the dust cleared, they staggered to their feet, coughing and blinking. The golems were buried under a mountain of rubble, their glowing eyes extinguished. Gary and Xenos looked at each other in disbelief, then up at the sky. A human dropship hovered overhead, the barrels of its weapons still smoking. Ropes unfurled from its belly, and figures in black combat armor fast roped down, assault rifles at the ready. The soldiers fanned out, securing the perimeter. Their leader, a grizzled man with a scar down his cheek, approached Gary and Xenos. He snapped a crisp salute. "Colonel Jake Maddox, Sigma Force. We've been tracking your suit's transponder, Johnson. Damn glad we found you in time." Gary returned the salute wearily. "Appreciate the assist, Colonel, but how did you find us out here?" Maddox's face turned grim. "We've been monitoring the Comar's movements. They've set up a major base of operations on Earth. We're mounting an assault to take it out." He looked Gary in the eye. "I need you on this, Johnson. You're the only one who's faced these bastards and lived. We could use your expertise." Gary hesitated, glancing at Xenos. The Quomar met his gaze steadily. "Our fight is not yet finished, human. I will see this through to the end." Gary nodded slowly. "All right, Colonel, we're in, but Xenos comes with us. We started this together, we'll finish it together." Maddox looked at the battered Quomar, then back at Gary. He shrugged. "Hell, if he's willing to fight, I won't say no to an extra gun. Let's move out." As the dropship lifted off, carrying them towards the Quomar base, Gary and Xenos sat in silence, tending to their wounds. The revelations of the golems weighed heavy on their minds. They had seen the suffering their war had inflicted on the Earth, the scars it had left on the very soul of the planet. Their personal rivalry seemed petty in the face of such devastation. Gary looked at Xenos, seeing not an enemy but a fellow warrior, a kindred spirit. They had both been blind to the true cost of their conflict, but no longer. As the dropship roared through the ashen skies, Gary and Xenos steeled themselves for what lay ahead. They knew they would have to confront not just the Quomar, but the consequences of their own actions. The fate of the Earth hung in the balance, and this time they would fight not as enemies but as allies, united by a common purpose, to save the world they had both helped to destroy. The dropship roared through the ashen skies, engines straining as it sped towards the Quomar base. Gary and Xenos sat in tense silence, checking their weapons and armor, preparing for the battle ahead. Colonel Maddox briefed his team, his voice hard and determined over the comm. "Our target is the central control room. We need to take out their command and control, disrupt their operations. Johnson, Xenos, you're our spearhead. Hit them hard and fast, clear a path for the rest of us." Gary nodded, glancing at Xenos. The Quomar king met his gaze, eyes burning with a fierce, shared resolve. Their rivalry, Their enmity had been forged into something new in the crucible of Chernobyl, a bond of respect, of understanding. They were warriors, united by a common cause. The dropship shuddered as anti-aircraft fire streaked past, the Komar base looming ahead. It was a sprawling, fortified complex, all gleaming metal and bristling gun emplacements. Maddox's voice crackled over the comm. 30 seconds to drop. Get ready. Gary and Xenos stood, bracing themselves as the rear hatch yawned open, wind whipping at their faces. The dropship banked hard, the ground rushing up to meet them. Go, 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 Maddox roared. Gary and Xenos leapt from the ship, plummeting towards the base in a controlled fall. Plasma fire stitched the air around them as the Komar defenders opened up, trying to swat them from the sky. They hit the ground hard, absorbing the impact with flexed knees and rolling to their feet. Maddox and his team were right behind them, fanning out and laying down a withering hail of covering fire. Move up, Gary shouted, charging towards the base's heavily armored entrance. Xenos was at his side, gauntlets glowing with power. They slammed into the doors like a thunderbolt, Gary's rifle spitting plasma bolts, Xenos's fists smashing Komar soldiers aside like rag dolls. They blasted their way into the base, the once bitter enemies now fighting as one, a seamless unit forged in the heat of battle. Komar soldiers poured into the corridors, energy weapons flaring. Gary and Xenos met them head-on, plasma and pulse bolts crisscrossing in deadly streams. They pushed deeper into the facility, Maddox and his team close behind. The resistance grew fiercer with every step, the Komar throwing everything they had at the intruders. But Gary and Xenos were unstoppable, a whirlwind of steel and fury, leaving a trail of shattered alien bodies in their wake. And then they saw them, the holding pens. Dozens of mutant creatures from the ruins of Chernobyl, penned up like cattle, wired with tubes and sensors. The twisted forms of bears, wolves, and other monstrosities writhed and howled, their cries of rage and pain echoing off the metal walls. "My God," Maddox breathed, "what are they doing to them?" Gary's eyes hardened as he took in the scene. They're experimenting on them, harvesting their DNA. Xenos growled, a sound of revulsion and anger. "Creating abominations, perversions of nature." A cold knot settled in Gary's gut as the true scope of the Komar's plan began to dawn on him. But there was no time to dwell on it. A fresh wave of defenders was sweeping in, energy weapons blazing. They fought their way onwards, the corridors ringing with the clash of weapons and the cries of the fallen. Every step was bought in blood and pain, but they didn't slow, didn't falter. They had to reach the control room, had to stop whatever madness the Komar were planning. At last they stood before the massive, reinforced doors of the central hub. Gary and Xenos exchanged a look, a silent moment of understanding passing between them. Whatever lay beyond those doors, they would face it together. Gary slapped the door controls and stormed inside, rifle raised, Xenos at his side. The control room was a vast circular chamber dominated by towering banks of alien machinery. And there, standing amidst it all, was a tall, spindly Komar in elaborate robes. The alien's eyes glittered with cold intelligence as it regarded the intruders. "Welcome, warriors of Earth," it hissed. "You're just in time to witness the birth of a new era." Gary stepped forward, his finger tightening on the trigger. "It's over, Komar. We're shutting you down." The alien laughed, a chittering sound that made Gary's skin crawl. "Foolish human, you have no idea what you've stumbled into. The mutants, the experiments, mere stepping stones on the path to our true goal." It gestured to the screens lining the walls, each displaying complex schematics and simulations. Gary's eyes widened in horror as he realized what he was seeing. "Terraforming," Xenos snarled. "You mean to reshape the Earth itself?" The Komar scientist smiled, a ghastly stretching of its mandibles. "A new Earth fit for Komar habitation. Your precious Deathworld, tamed and broken to our will, and your species extinct, a mere footnote in the history of our conquest." Gary's blood ran cold. The scale of it, the sheer callous evil, staggered him. But only for a moment. Then the rage came, hot and pure, a righteous fury that burned away all doubt, all hesitation. He glanced at Xenos, seeing the same fire in the alien warrior's eyes. No words were needed. They knew what had to be done. As one, they charged, weapons roaring, a battle cry on their lips. The Komar scientist screeched, its own guards surging forward to meet them. And the final battle was joined, a desperate struggle for the fate of a world, the soul of a species. Gary and Xenos fought like men possessed, their skills, their strength pushed to the absolute limit. Plasma bolts seared the air, vibroblades hummed and clashed, gauntlets smashed and crushed. They were a blur of motion, a symphony of violence, two warriors united in a dance of death. The Komar guards fell before them, one by one, unable to stand against the fury of their onslaught. The scientist scrabbled at a control panel, its long fingers flying over the keys. Gary saw it, understood with cold certainty what it meant to do. He lunged, hurling himself forward in a desperate attempt to stop it. But Xenos was faster. The Quomar king slammed into the scientist, bearing it to the ground in a tangle of limbs. They rolled, struggling, claws and fists and flashing blades, a snarling, hissing knot of lethal intent. Gary dispatched the last guard and spun, racing to Xenos's aid. But he was an instant too late. The scientist reared back, a long, wickedly serrated blade clutched in its hand. It plunged the knife into Xenos's chest, piercing through his battered armor, sinking to the hilt. Xenos roared in pain and fury, his gauntlets clamping down on the scientist's head. There was a sickening crunch, and the Komar went limp, its skull crushed like an eggshell. "Xenos!" Gary cried, dropping to his knees beside the fallen warrior. Luminescent blood leaked from the wound pooling on the floor. Xenos looked up at Gary, his eyes already dimming, the fire in them fading. "We did it, human," he rasped, his voice a weak rattle. "We won." Gary clasped Xenos's hand, feeling the strength ebbing from the alien's grip. "Hold on, Xenos, just hold on. Medics are on the way." But Xenos shook his head, a faint smile on his bloodied lips. "No, Gary, this is it for me, the final battle, the last hunt." He coughed, a wet, wrenching sound. "You fought well, human. You are a true warrior, a worthy foe, and a true friend." Gary bowed his head, hot tears stinging his eyes. "And you, Xenos, it was an honor." The Quomar's grip tightened for a final moment, a last surge of strength. "Defend your world, Gary, defend your people. The fight goes on." And with those words, Xenos, king of the Quomar, slipped away, his eyes closing for the last time. Gary knelt there, holding his hand, as the sounds of battle faded, and a deep, heavy silence settled over the control room. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.